sincerely thank the India Foundation for this invitation that I've received for this great initiative, which I think is an expression of our common concern for a safe future and safer world, where the humankind would feel safer, and also that the nature and with all its resources will be preserved from all kind of threat. But at the moment we are discussing about threat from terrorism and how to counter it. But as we are discussing this issue here, we also need to have a common understanding or common approach on what causes terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. Of course, the situation would be very different from country to country, from a society to society, but any act, I think, that undermines the life, liberty, and livelihood of an individual would be somehow, constitute act of terrorism. And the expectation is that there are laws and there are machineries to counter that. There are justice system to protect those rights. And also, we have, there are, of course, different perception about, the previous speakers have said that there are different perception about what constitutes terrorism from a place to place. We see things from a victim perceptions and also from the state perception. Nepal has been through an insurgency. Of course, it witnessed that insurgency for 10 years that began in 1996 and ended in a peace process in 2006, but we are still very unsure about the direction it's going to take. But one thing that we witnessed is the gun fell silent after the peace process, peace negotiation in 2006. The insurgents, we call them Maoists, they have come to the democratic process. They are now in the government in Nepal. That's a good sign, because on an average, every day, 7 or 8 people being killed. It was definitely a tragic incident, but the constitution that we have got after that has in a way also given legitimacy to the use of weapons and insurgency method as the appropriate means for political change. There is a fear that this might legitimize similar tendency in future, especially if the governments are unstable and weak and are divided on what causes terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. Initially, like Nepal, that was suffering, of course. India is next door neighbor. In the US, these 3 countries had put the Maoists on terrorist lists. That was removed at various stages by different countries. Of course, we keep saying that there are socio-economic and various forms of disparities. They form ideal situation for a terror group to mobilize people, exploit their sentiments, use them. Vulnerable citizenry is the best breeding ground for this kind of approaches. But then certain mindset also seem to work to exploit that situation and further their political ambition, then actually addressing those grievances. But I said that the attack on life and liberty and livelihood of an individual is, of course, that should constitute an act of terror. But and also attack on public and state property, those collaborating, aiding and abetting from inside and outside, and outside the borders, also somehow giving legitimacy. They would be considered as giving legitimacy to those kind of situations. But then, how did that situation arise? Yesterday, Mark gave a wonderful presentation about terrorism in the age of, and cyber age, all that technology. Of course, technology will always be there, but even without technology, these trends have been visible in, if the change of regime or if causing or inflicting torture on society is the measurements of success that has happened. Poor and irresponsive governance, of course, create a situation for that kind of act. Subversive activities against the legitimate government, legitimate authorities, state order, and weak justice also. That is, I'm purely speaking from our own experience, because I think this kind of experience, sharing of this experience will help a lot in devising, a counter-terror method. When the Maoists came to power in Nepal, first time in 2006, 7, and then again 2008, now they are a big partner in the government. There was definitely hope that Maoists, there is still hope, because they have got the mandate of the people to rule. But what has happened is undermining the legitimate institutions and appropriating those rights of the institutions. Say, for instance, when I'm speaking here, I read in the newspaper very interesting developments back home in Nepal. The Prime Minister called the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and asked him to resign because there are certain controversies regarding his age and all that. The Chief Justice refused, and a secretary of the Judicial Council, directly under the Judicial Council is headed by the Chief Justice, but directly under the instruction of the Prime Minister, declared that the Chief Justice has been removed and somebody else has become the acting Chief Justice. Now, why I'm saying this is the collapse of justice system or executive interference in the justice system will lead to people not trusting in the ability of the state to give justice, and they will seek justice on the street. And that would be another form of, that would lead to anarchy, and anarchy is the best atmosphere that terrorists might use always. So undermining the legitimate authority of the state and the justice system also, maybe, they would be manifested. Terrorism would be manifested in many ways. We have seen that. But then this eruption of anarchy in this form perhaps, somehow disappoints that the peace process and the Maoists coming to the power and the people of the party that people have mandated to rule are not moving in promoting democracy, and defeat of democracy would be an ideal situation for the terrorism to win. That fear still remains in Nepal. Then also, Maoists joining the peace process in Nepal was perhaps a good sign for the region also, because when we are discussing about ideological terrorism, the left insurgent groups together had formed a Southeast Asian platform together. Maoists joining the democratic process perhaps discouraged others, perhaps encouraged some of them also, although it hasn't happened. But then destroying the system from within, destroying democracy from within, and and subverting democracy from within also should be seen as another form of victory or terror path. I know, Mr. Chair, we are running out of the time. I'll not go into details of, like what, but then my only concern would be if the use of weapons and violent means would be accepted as means, legitimate means of power change that would somehow, invite peril of democracy, or at least threat to democracy, and creating a situation for terror. Now, almost every leader in the region and outside, in the international forum, in the UN, and says that terrorism, after all, is a terrorism, and there is no good terrorism and no bad terrorism. So any kind of investment, capital investment, or political investment on terror group would again only be promoting. Previous speakers, they have very eloquently and in details given that would establish the legitimacy of terrorism here or there. And so if that doesn't happen, that will vastly discourage terrorism in any shape, anywhere in future. Of course, technology with sophisticated technology would always be used, but it's basically the approach, ideological, political approach, and commitment to defeat terrorism that will form an effective way of countering terrorism. Thank you once again for inviting me.